Project Green forums are free and open to the public, and attendance provides continuing education credit hours. Our forums inspire us, especially me, for the growing season to come. I want to thank Beth Fisher and Bon Drager and the Iowa City Public Library staff for hosting the presentations. Today's program is an encore presentation. Project Green was formed in 1968. Our nonprofit organization has devoted its resources to beautifying green spaces and educating the public about the environment and conservation practices. Volunteers have donated more than 1,000 hours of volunteer service in 2023 and 2024. If you're a Project Green volunteer, please stand and be recognized. Come on. All gardeners, from novice to experienced, are invited to join volunteers on Monday, beginning May 5th through October. They help out at Project Green Gardens from 9 to 11 a.m. at 820 Park Road. It's a fun way to make new garden friends and become a part of a special group of volunteers who care for the Project Green Gardens. Our Open Garden Weekend 2025 will be held earlier this year, Saturday and Sunday, June 28th and 29th. Please consider offering your garden or nominating a garden for this special tour. There's no admission charge thanks to the generosity of our homeowners and our business sponsors. The botanical tour is a delight to the senses and has the potential to become a regional tourism event. And we're pleased to announce our first 2025 sponsor, Sustainable Landscape Solutions. You can watch for details on our website and social media. Since Project Green retired its annual and very successful plant sale in 2018, it now relies on financial contributions to enable us to continue our work. Your support is greatly appreciated and can be made in 3 ways: online at our website, through the Community Foundation of Johnson County at our endowment fund, or through the City of Iowa City at the Green Fund. Today, we're not following our normal format. We're going to show an encore film with Mark Vitosh, DNR forester, about replacing ash trees and growing healthy shade trees. After the video, we'll have another chat and draw for raffle prizes. And Bond is going to introduce the film.
Okay, this is a film from the Library Channel. If you're not familiar with the Library Channel, Iowa City Public Library has a YouTube channel. You can find it. And almost every Project Green program that has ever happened is available for you to watch. This was not a Project Green program. This is a great lecture by Mark Vitosh, who some of you may know is really an expert on trees and planting. So I hope you all enjoy.
So now I'm going to talk briefly about if you want to establish a healthy tree, what are some of the things to think about, and I'll talk about some of the potential alternatives, different species that you might consider. This is a situation where they only had room for 1 tree, and this tree is not very healthy. This is not what you want. This is not a success. In this situation, actually, some of this could have been prevented. This tree actually has what we call girdling roots that are actually starting to grow around the stem. And I didn't bring the picture, but when this person was trying to diagnose the problem, I said, send me a picture of the stem, and they did, and you can actually see the roots growing right into the trunk of the tree, and that actually suffocates the tree. But when we plant trees, sometimes we can identify those roots and actually prune them before we plant a tree, so to prevent that. The other thing is sometimes if we plant trees too deep, and I'm going to talk about planting depth in a little bit, but if we plant them too deep, the tree adjusts to that and actually puts on new roots, called adventitious roots, out of its trunk, and those can sometimes go around and actually create stem girdling roots. So if you prune or prepare your tree properly for planting and plant it at the correct depth, you can avoid something like this. So growing healthy trees, this is what we want. This is a beautiful shade tree. This happens to be a red oak. Very nice tree. This tree is probably only 20 years old. A lot of people think oak don't grow very fast, but especially like red oak can grow pretty fast. Beautiful shaped tree. I have 2 of those in my neighborhood. That's not my house. I wish it was, but that's a very nice shade tree. But that's what we're trying. If we do things correctly, obviously certain things can happen out of our control, but if we plan correctly, a lot of times we can avoid a lot of the problems that people have 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road because we didn't quite do things right, or we went the wrong direction. So we can avoid problems in a lot of cases. So what are some of the things? The thing I want you to think about is if you're going to plant a new tree, don't go in the situation and say, I want a linden tree there, or I want an oak tree there. What this basically says is you need to evaluate all these conditions, and you need to see what's going to fit best in the area that you want to plant a tree. So you need to look at the soils. Are they well drained versus poorly drained? Because even if it's poorly drained, there are some species, tree species, that could work in that situation. So you could still plant some trees. See how much sun you have. I mean, if you don't have more than 50% sunlight during the day, there's a number of trees that like full sun, and they're not going to grow well in shade. But there are some species that can tolerate some shade and do very well. So it's important to know what that is. And then also just the aspect, is this on the north side of the house versus the south side of the house? The south in the wintertime gets a lot more sun, can heat up, and there's certain species, I can tell you, like serviceberry, redbud, they don't like a southwest facing, they don't like that heat in the summertime or even in the wintertime. They like a northeast or eastern side where they're protected. They're actually trees that grow native in our woodlands on kind of shaded edges and stuff like that. So you want to place them where they're going to do well. The other thing is to look at utilities and look up. I still go into communities and I see a beautiful shade tree planted, and I look up, and just 10 feet this way is a power line. And I know in 25 years they're going to go zing, and they're going to cut that off on that side, and that tree's not going to look very good. So if that's the only place you have to plant, then there are smaller trees that you may be able to plant in that situation. If you have a driveway, think about, you may not want a small, like a crabapple or something, coming out of the driveway that you can't prune up and visually see for safety. So think about all those things ahead of time. The other thing is, and I have it on here, you need to call Iowa 1 call before you dig, 811. That's the law. Before you, even though you swear you know where all the wires are and the cables, if you're going to do any digging in your yard in Iowa, you're required to call that you got to give them 2 working days during the week before they can do your locates and stuff. So once you look at all that stuff and see how much space you have, then you can start thinking about selection. I did bring a publication from the DNR. It talks about selecting trees, and it's basically alternatives to maple, and we'll talk about why that doesn't mean you can't plant a maple, but we'll talk about that a little bit. But think about, I see a lot of situations where people love like spruce trees or pine trees as foundation plants, but they plant them right next to the house on the corner, and those trees want to get 50 feet tall, and they want to get 35 feet wide. And then they'll call 10 years later and say, well, can I cut the top out and stuff because it's starting to want to go through the windows and do this? I can't believe I'm saying this, but there are evergreens that would even fit that situation. There's these things called dwarf conifers. They're smaller trees that pine, spruce, firs, that if you only have something that can only get 8 feet tall, a lot of times there's plants that may fit your situation. So really evaluate that site, because to me, by doing this at the beginning, again, you can avoid a lot of the problems 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Okay. And then plant diversity, and I'll talk about that. And question is, why diversity? Well, it's very simple. The theme of this talk, I can say a couple things. Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, and we got another one coming, Asian longhorn beetle. The Asian longhorn beetle loves maple. That's one reason we're looking at alternatives to maple. And In Iowa, we've been doing some studies in small communities. We've done about 300, mostly in Eastern Iowa, where we've gone and literally GPS every public tree in these communities, like Lisbon and Solon and North Liberty. And out of that 300, the average community has about 17% ash on their just their public trees, but most communities have 34 to 37% maple. So most of these communities have over 50% maple, just maple and ash. So we know what happened in the 50s and 60s with Dutch elm. This is our next Dutch elm coming here with emerald ash borer. We have over 3 million ash trees in our communities, and we have over 50 million throughout the state in our woodlands. A large percentage of those ash trees are going to die over the next, 5 to 30 years, whatever it is. There's going to be a lot of loss of a lot of trees, just like when we lost the elms. So diversity is not 5 different types of oaks or 5 different types of maple or 5 different types of pine. But here, they have a spruce. This is a maple. This is a white pine. I think that's actually an oak. I'm not sure about that one. And they actually have a catalpa right here too. So they have 4 or 5 different genuses, not just species, but different genera of trees. And the thing we found is a lot of these diseases and insects are often not generalists, they're specific. So far, the emerald ash borer has gone mostly for ash, but there's been a tree called a fringe tree in Ohio, which is in the same family as ash. They've actually found it on this fringe tree in Ohio. So it might jump to species within the same family, but so far in their tests, it hasn't jumped to oak and walnut and some of those other species. But there's not a lot of, like Asian longhorn beetle has, I think 20 plus hosts, but one of its favorite is maple, but it doesn't like oak, and it doesn't like linden. So again, if you have a lot of diversity, and I know if you were like the one house I showed, you only have room for 1 tree, that's a tougher situation. But if you have room for more, the more diversity, and that's important in our communities. And our communities are really starting to do this. In Iowa City on McAllister Street down by Terry Trueblood, they just planted a bunch of trees, and there's probably 7 different species in there. So they're really mixing it up that if they have a problem, they're not going to lose everything. That's our best. I lose a lot of sleep at night because of all these bugs and diseases. I have nightmares about them. But our only defense is diversity. It really is. Our only true defense is to try to diversify because we know how important trees are. So we need to keep planting them, but we need to diversify. So like I said, make sure before you plant. This is just a little commercial on bigger is not always better when you're planting trees. So when people are going to buy trees and stuff, they think, well, I'm going to buy the biggest I can because I'm getting older and I want to watch it grow, and I'm not going to wait for one this small because it's not going to get big enough, okay? Well, this is actually in Iowa City. This is a number of years ago, but this is the size of the tree that they planted. That tree was probably 18 feet tall when they planted it. I came back 4 years later, that's the same tree. It's not much bigger. So bigger is not always better, because a lot of times the thing you need to think about is if they're digging that up, like ball and burlap or even spading it, you might lose 50 to 60% of the root system when you dig that. Even if they do it all by the right calculations and specs and stuff, they still lose a lot of root system. So they often say for every inch of caliper that you have, or diameter, you have usually about a year shock that those roots need to get readjusted and stuff like that. So the bigger, the more shock. And if you just look at developments around town where they bring in a lot of bigger trees, and you look at some of those developments 5, 6 years later, you see a lot of stressed trees a lot of times. I mean, there are some trees that do well because the nurseries do their best to do it right, but bigger is not always better. So even having a tree that's maybe an inch or even a ½ inch or a quarter of an inch in diameter, that tends to have a better root system in balance with the top. So a lot of times that tree's going to sit there a lot less time before it starts growing. It's going to do better. And I've seen situations, I don't expect you to plant little seedlings, but I can plant little seedlings that we plant in the forest in my job, and I planted some seedlings at Lake McBride, and we plant them. I have one planting that we planted 3 years ago, so this is the third growing season. I have some 8 to 9 foot oak trees already in 3 years from a little seedling because it had a good root system, didn't have a lot of shock. Now again, I don't expect you to plant seedlings, but something a little more in balance I think is pretty critical to, so bigger is not always better. But if you're going to go a little bigger, you can get trees tree spaded or ball and burlap. You can do that. But if you're using tree spades, the bigger tree spade, the better. So if it's a lot bigger than the root or than the tree, that means it's picking up more root system. So that helps too. And trees that size too are often cheaper. And if you want to plant them yourself, they're easier to handle if they're in a pot or something like that. So if you want to do it yourself, it's a lot easier to work with. Because a lot of times those big ball and burlap, they need a excavator or something to even pick them up to get them set in the ground correctly and straight and all that. It can be pretty hard to plant. So proper planting. This is really critical. There's been a lot of research probably in the last 10 years on planting, and kind of related to some problems that we had in some states to windstorms and different things, and some people started doing some research. But on the tree, this little area here is called the, basically it's the root collar or trunk collar, basically where the trunk meets the root. That area is the depth that you want that tree. So that root flare, if you look at trees that have been in the ground for a long time in our parks and stuff, they'll have that root that really flares out, okay? If you go to a landscape and you see a tree that looks like a telephone pole in the ground and there's no flare to that tree in the ground, that tree was planted too deep. And the reason that's a concern is a gentleman up in Minnesota, Gary Johnson, who's a researcher up there in urban forestry and nurseries and stuff like that, they had a windstorm up there a number of years ago, and they noticed a lot of trees snapped off. So they started investigating these trees, and what they found, a lot of them, they had these stem girdling roots that I was talking about earlier. And as they actually pulled the soil away, they noticed a lot of those trees were planted, the root flares were down anywhere from 2 inches to 8 to 10 inches below grade. So the other thing we find is if a lot of times people will call and say, my tree is 18 years old, and the last couple years it leaves out, but it leaves out later and later, and then in the fall it drops its leaves earlier and earlier. And it's been doing that the last couple years, and it's starting to kind of die at the top. First question I ask is, does it have a flare, or does it look like a pole in the ground? And 9 times out of 10, it has a pole, looks like a pole, and even after 15 years, that tree, depending on species, can start to decline if it was planted too deep 10 to 15 years before. Because where that root flare is where there's air exchange cells, and some species can't take being planted too deep. And so they'll grow for a while and they'll look like they're fine, but even 10 years later, they can start to have problems. Or if they're planted too deep, again, they could get those stem girdling roots that will start to girdle the trunk and then cause dieback in the tree. So that root flare is really critical. So when you get a tree, instead of planting it in the depth that it comes from the nursery, nurseries are working at this really hard, but the first thing you want to do is actually find that root flare. And here you can see the root starting to flare out. That's the depth. Well, that was the soil line. That tree was 2 to 3 inches too deep in the pot. So if you would have planted it, you would have planted that tree too deep. And 10, 15, 20 years down the road, that tree could have had some serious issues and started to decline. Again, nurseries are working at this, but we can do some preventative things ourselves to try to prevent damage or problems later. And that's one of the things that you want to find. And then, once you find that, then you measure from here down to the bottom of the pot, and that's the depth that you dig your hole. Then you dig your hole, and that's how deep you dig it. Because if you dig it too deep, before you measure that, you'll never pack it in enough, and then when you plant it, it could settle and then end up too deep. So it's important to measure that first and then dig the depth. And if we go back to this, the big thing is wide. The wider you can go this way and rough that soil up, the better, because you're working up this area kind of like a garden, so those roots are going to have a better chance to get out. And if you have a tough soil, the best way to do it is the more that you go this way, because the thing you got to remember is the tree roots are in the top probably 6 to 24 inches, and that's where they want to be. And in some of our soils, the root depth may only be 10 inches. Some of our urban soils and stuff are compacted. They may not even be able to go deeper than 10 or 12 inches. So working that area up so those roots can get out this way is key to giving them a better chance, okay? And again, I see eyes with questions, but we'll get to them towards the end. So this is one at proper depth. You can actually see, I just pulled the mulch away a little bit. You can actually see that root flare. They did a great job. And sometimes you got to be careful with urban trees, because if you see this, you think that's the flare, but that's actually the graft. You'll see that on apple trees and fruit trees, but even our urban trees are sometimes bud grafted or grafted onto a rootstock. And so you'll get this graft union, but you still look for those roots, and that's the depth that you want to plant it at. So you just want to cover up that flare, or just cover up those first roots, okay? So this is a tree that was in a planting, and I started digging, and I've already gone the length of that pin, and I still haven't found a root yet. So that tree was planted too deep. But luckily, I was inspecting it, we dug it up and started over. But, I mean, that tree had been planted like 6 days before I looked at it. So, I mean, it was easy for them to redo it. But if it had been in there a couple years, that may be that's a lot harder to deal with. So preventative and getting it planted correctly at the beginning is really key. So sometimes we'll get potted trees and we can actually see roots, sometimes bigger roots like this that are kind of encircling a little bit, or they might even get to the degree of this. And there's been more research now showing that if we just put that in the ground like that, that tree's going to have a really tough time to get out. So up in Minnesota, they tried some research and they did this. They took that same tree and they cut 4 sides. They did what we call a box cut. And they actually cut off about 1 inch of all those roots on each side and squared that up and then planted it. And then they planted the trees that had the encircling roots. These slowed down a little bit the first year, but then they did a lot better than the ones with the encircling roots because those roots never got out. That seems like a very drastic method, and I can't believe I have to tell you to do that, but if you have encircling roots, I would really look at doing something like that, because right now if you don't, those trees are going to have a tough time developing with those circling roots down below. So before I talk about water, you get that tree in the ground, you awfully center it up, and then what you take from the ground, you put back in. So amendments, peat, good soil, all that stuff, especially if you have a bad soil or not a very good soil. If you put a lot of good stuff in that hole for a tree, those roots are going to want to stay there. So you're just making a big pot. If you can't amend your whole yard, then you shouldn't amend that hole. Now with shrubs and stuff, their roots aren't as extensive, smaller perennials. You could probably do some amending, and we do that with blueberries and stuff like that because we have to change the pH and different things. But with trees, those roots are in the top 2 feet of the soil, but they also can go twice the height of the tree. So if you have a 50-foot tree, you could have roots eventually 100 feet out. So amending that soil, if that's really good soil and it's not so good once they get to the edge of the planting hole, those roots will often turn and stay in that hole. So you're just, again, putting kind of in a pot in the ground. So what you take out, you put back in. And that's why making a wider hole can really help that tree develop. And then watering, this has actually kind of changed over the last couple of years with research. So I probably did one of these talks here 15 so years ago, and I used to say, water it really good and then let it dry out for 7 to 10 days. Now they say, water less and water more often. So the first year or so, you treat that tree like it's still in your nursery. And so you plant it and you basically water just around the root ball. So you don't water clear out in here. Notice she's got it pretty close to the trunk of the tree. You just water right in that spot. And for the first year, you just water that root ball. And you might water it 2 or 3 times a week, depending on your soils. Now, if you have a clay soil and you know that even a couple gallons is going to percolate right back up, you may only do it once or twice versus 3 times. But I usually give it a couple gallons each time I water it. So I'm going to water it that first year very religiously. And then going in the fall, I'm going to try to water it again so when the ground freezes, that root ball was pretty moist. We don't want to, if it's a dry freeze, it's not as good for the root system. And then the second year, I may start watering in the spring, and then I probably try to start weaning it off after the second year. And we'll talk about mulch, but if I have mulch, I'm going to need to water less. Now, if I have a tree, if we have a drought situation, and you planted a tree 3 years ago, and you watered the first 2 years, and then you stopped. In 2012, when we had a drought, we told people basically if they had planted a tree in the last 5 years during the drought period, it'd be helpful to go back out and water that tree some during those drought situations. But usually once they get past that 5 years, the root systems are established. If they're going to live, they're going to live. But if you can wean it off going into the second year, try to do that. But basically what they say, for every inch of diameter you try to give it, or caliper, you try to give it 2 to 4 gallons each time you water for a tree. Then I realize in our yards we like to have grass, but the thing to remember is grass is a competitor. It's in the top, the roots are in the top 6 to 8 inches. They're in the same area where those tree roots are, so there's a lot of competition. The other thing is these cause a very severe condition, and it's called Homo sapiens sapien weed whackus killis. Okay? The common name is mower blight. Okay? The thing you got to remember is the plumbing system of that tree is just underneath the bark. So here, even this nick has disturbed some of the water distribution and food distribution up and down that plumbing system of that tree. It's just underneath the bark. If you see green, you've damaged the vascular system of that tree if you nick it with the weed whacker or the mower or whatever. And these basically are old mower damage that eventually these don't, if they don't seal, they often get decayed. And long term, that could create a risk tree or a tree that could fall over. And so prevention is really critical. But I see a lot of trees in commercial areas where they don't control the mowing folks, and they're just destroying beautiful trees. And those trees, sometimes you can walk up to them and almost knock them off because they've been girdled so many times. They get a lot of this callus tissue and try to survive, but they don't. So mowers can cause, and weed whackers, even that string can cause significant damage. So mulch is a good thing. It's not perfect. You can get mold and mushrooms and different things that can grow out of there that may cause allergies and stuff like that. But generally, if you're going to mulch, I go 2 to 4 inches thick, and I pull it away from the trunk, but the further out I go, the better. I don't expect you to do like I have in my yard. I don't like grass, but they've done research that when trees are smaller, if you follow the edge of the branches, the drip line out, those trees grow a lot better compared to if you have one over here where you don't extend the mulch. Where you extend the mulch, those trees grow better. Again, I don't expect you to do that, but even if you do a 2 to 3 foot circle, especially for the first couple years, that conserves water, adds organic matter to the soil. I would avoid sawdust, grass, mulch, and stuff like that, but I'd use more fiber wood chips tend to work a little better. But you don't want to do this either. You don't want to mound it right up to the trunk, because this is like adding more soil to the tree. So you got to be really careful not to over mulch. Okay, sometimes we stake trees. My big message on staking is if you can avoid it, avoid it. If you plant that tree and it's stable, and what I do is if it looks pretty stable, I walk away from it. Come back in a couple days, and if it looks like you took a crowbar and that tree moved so much that it was actually moving the soil back and forth in the ball, and the ball's moving, then you might want to stake it for a year. But if I stake it, I'm going to use some type of cloth or nylon or rubber, but I'm not going to use wire through a rubber hose because those are too stiff. But when I stake it, I'm going to stake it loose enough so when the wind blows, that tree moves some. I don't want it so tight that it can't move, because it needs to build up its stability, and it builds up its stability with the wind blowing. I've seen situations where it's too tight and they leave it that way, and then 10 years later the tree snaps off where they had it staked. So you got to be careful. But if you can avoid it, I would actually avoid it. But if you need to do it, I would do it for about a year and use something softer and allow it to move some. But this is what happens when you leave the rubber hose on too long, or if you leave the strap on. The top of this tree is dead. And that's how we noticed there was a strap there. They were trying to help the tree and they left it on there too long. And that was a 10-year-old tree that died because they didn't get that off. So pruning. Going to just talk briefly about that. Some of the things when to prune. There's a couple times I avoid. Spring, when we're getting new growth. Fall, color change. Most people say the best time to prune is during the dormant season, especially if you have oaks. If you have oak trees, you should only prune in like late November, December, January, and February. You should not prune oaks during the growing season at all. If you have to, because they got a broken branch or something like that, or the moving truck's coming in and you have to take that branch off, you cut that branch off and you put latex paint on that wound immediately, like within the first minute. Because there's a beetle that can carry a fungus called oak wilt to that open wound because it feeds on sap. And if it feeds on that wound, if it's a red oak, that tree could die in 6 weeks after that beetle arrives. So the best way to prevent oak wilt is not to prune oaks during the growing season, okay? But on other species like ash, maple, crab apples, pruning this time of year, actually some of the research is showing that the wounds close quicker. So when we cut a branch off, that tree does not heal. It seals. It puts a chemical barrier inside in 3 layers inside the tree, and then it grows new callus tissue that turns into bark and vascular system and seals that wound shut. You've seen the callus tissue before. Looks like a donut. If you do a good job, it'll close that wound. So we want to prune in a way to promote that. And they say on a lot of species, if you prune in June or maybe even in July, you might get a little better response than if you prune it in the wintertime. But again, I still wouldn't do that on oaks, okay? So some of the things with young trees, especially shade trees, pruning weak branches, rubbing and crossing branches, especially like on crab apples and stuff, you'll get a lot of branches that tend to cross and rub. On shade trees like oak, maple, lindens, tulip poplar, elms, you want 1 straight leader. And if you start to get 2 leaders, you want to pick one of those off so you can train it to 1 leader. If you leave those 2, a lot of times they're V-shaped, and as they get bigger, they actually push apart, and this V-shape usually has a seam that can split the tree down. And it'll usually happen 25 years later. But if you prune that one 25 years before, you won't have that problem later. So you can really help. In the 98 windstorm, I saw so many trees that if they would have been pruned younger, a lot of those trees wouldn't have broken. I mean, there's a lot of trees, if the winds are really high, are still going to have problems, but we can really improve the structure and their defense to storms if we prune them correctly. There's a really good publication from Iowa State called Pruning Trees and Shrubs, and I'm just touching on some of the high notes because of the time tonight, but there's a good publication that talks about a lot of this stuff. Dead and sick branches, and then you might do clearance. I mean, if you're mowing or you want site clearance, you have to prune some branches up over time. So this is what I want you to think about. This is a 13-foot tree, okay? 6-foot person. All these branches, if this is in Iowa City, their regulations say they have to prune like up to 12 feet or 13 feet over the street and 8 feet over the sidewalk. Well, all these branches on this tree that's 13 feet will be removed in the life of that tree. That tree that was just planted, all those branches will be removed. So here's the process you need to think about. Is these branches grow from the tips this way, they get bigger in the trunk this way, but they get taller up this way. So they put on new wood like this. They don't stretch. So if you know that you need 8-foot clearance, all those branches in the first 8 feet of that tree you just planted are temporary branches that you're going to take off over time. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a pretty important concept to think about when you're looking at your trees. So again, this is about an 8-foot tree. The only thing that's going to be left is that main leader. If we need to clear to 8 feet, all these branches will eventually be gone. Okay? The thing I don't want you to do, though, is come in here some Sunday and cut 7 feet right away. Because if you take too much of that tree, you can really set it back. And I'll talk about it a little, but generally those lower branches, so if I have a tree like this, the first thing I look, do I have a straight leader? And if I have a double leader up here, I'll prune and fix that because that's going to be my permanent tree up there, okay? These branches I leave till they're about 1 inch, and then I usually get them off before they're 2 inches. What they say is you let them grow, and if you're going to prune temporary branches, you get them before they're half the diameter of the trunk. So if you have a 2-inch trunk, you should be pruning your branches at 1 inch that you're going to take off. Okay? If you have a 3-inch trunk, you get them before they get above 1.5 inches. But if you use that, kind of let them grow 1 inch and get them before they're 2 inches, by doing that, one thing with pruning is you want to minimize the size of wounds. The research is actually showing the smaller the wound that you make, the better that wound seals and the less decay we get in those wounds. That doesn't mean if you have a bigger branch and it's broken or something that you don't cut it, but the research shows the bigger those branches are, the more likely they are to get decay in them over time. So if you are starting from scratch and you can develop and determine what you're going to take, if you take those branches when they're smaller, you're going to have a lot less decay develop in that tree long term. Okay? Okay, so those key points. To me, about the first 5 to 25 years of that tree's life are pretty critical and kind of just like kids, training them, developing them, getting them going, then kick them out the door. Hopefully before 25 years. But so that doesn't mean at year 4 that you won't do some pruning. If I had a double leader, I don't wait till it gets 1 inch. I get that as small as I can and I get it off, so I'm training that 1 leader. If I have broken branches, I may do some pruning, but when I first plant, the more leaf material I can leave. The other thing I kind of use is I really want to leave, as long as I can, probably 75% of that tree in crown. That even means on big trees. If you take too much at one time, you can really set those trees back because they need leaves to produce the food that they use to survive. And then correct multiple leaders or weak connections. Identify the lowest branch in the permanent canopy for like how high are you going to clear, and then leave those temporary branches till they're 1 inch and get them off before they're half diameter of the trunk. And then prune oaks during the dormant season. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with just a few trees, shade trees. I'm pretty close on time here.
You're fine.
Okay. Honey locust is a decent shade tree, especially if you have a yard where you got some room. They're going to get 40 to 70 feet tall. If you have an area that you like to grow grass, they have a very kind of diffuse shade that allows some sunlight in. They do have little small leaflets that kind of get sucked in the doors, and people don't always like that. But the urban selections are thornless and podless. If you go out in the wild, they have big pods on them and they have big thorns out in the woods, but our urban selections don't. And there are some selections in the publication. So that's one decent, that's actually the Pedmal. They're pretty durable. They don't have a lot of insect and disease problems. They can have a few issues, but they're pretty tolerable to urban conditions. And again, this is just a few. There's the book I gave you. There's probably 30 or 40 different selections in there. Depends on your site. Again, here's my neighbor's red oak. I really like red oak. Has a nice fall color. But remember, it has acorns. You may not want that next to the house because once they start producing in 20 years, there's pretty big clangs and noises in the fall when those acorns drop. But something to think about. But they can make, if you have a bigger backyard or a bigger front yard and have some room, they can make a decent shade tree. I like oaks. Another one I like is chinkapin. It's actually a native tree, but it's very big. It can get 60 to 75 feet tall, maybe have a 35 or 40 foot spread. So you would need a pretty big yard for this. Probably not the best as a street tree, but kind of a unique tree. Looks, grows a lot like big white, native white oak as far as its trunk and stuff like that. Here's one more oak that makes a decent urban tree, swamp white oak. Neither of the chinkapin or the swamp have much for fall color. They're basically yellow, kind of off brown yellow. But the swamp does have on the developing bark, it gets kind of peely, not quite like a birch, but it's called exfoliating. It does peel, so it does have some winter characteristic to it too a little bit. Ginkgo is actually a good urban tree. Very slow growing though. They'll get 50 to 60 feet tall, probably a 30 plus spread, but they're just really slow. But they make a really nice shade tree. There's some nice ones in the Pedmal that have been here a long time, very tough conditions, usually pretty adaptable and kind of open. They can allow some sunlight, but that's a street tree over on the east side. This is kind of a different one that people are starting. It's a native tree, Kentucky coffee tree. When you first plant it, it looks like a dead stick, and it takes it about 10 years before it actually starts looking like a tree. But it will, I promise. I planted one 3 years ago at the fairgrounds, and it's starting to look like a tree a little bit. But when we first planted, it just had some sprouts, and when you get them, they're kind of like sticks. But just give them some time, and they'll turn into a swan. They're a nice tree. Now, they can have seed pods, but I think there's at least one selection called Espresso, I believe is podless. You'd have to check. Hackberry, not a bad shade tree, good urban tree, doesn't have a lot of big issues. Another, again, pretty good sized tree, more of a yellow fall color. We're starting to bring back some elms. There are some American selections now that are supposed to have some tolerance. I think there's a few listed in the book that I gave you. This is actually one at City High, still alive. There are some that have survived, and so they're actually starting to develop some. Now there's some hybrids out there too. I would avoid those, but the true American selections, there are some now that we can look back and maybe start planting some elms back. American linden, pretty big shade tree. The only challenge with this, if we have heavy populations of Japanese beetle. Japanese beetle loves this tree, and a number of years ago on the east side we had some pretty good populations, and it kind of made them turn brown. It won't kill them, but these are pretty fast growing and they'll get big, 60 plus, so you need a pretty good space. Tulip poplar, kind of a unique one. Has kind of a unique flower. This is actually the fruit, but the flower is kind of green, kind of unique. This is the leaf, looks like a tulip. Pretty fast growing tree, but get rather large. Again, you would need a pretty good space for those, but it's another alternative. A few small trees, redbud, but usually likes protected sites. These will get 15 to 25 feet tall. Again, this is just a few. These aren't necessarily my favorites either. There's a lot of options, but you go to Iowa State, they have good lists. There's actually a website called Iowa Tree Pest with an S.com, and you go on there, it has alternatives to ash. There's a good list from Iowa State that has all kinds of different cultivars and varieties of different trees. Serviceberry, another one though, smaller tree, probably 15, 20 feet, has nice white flowers, has an edible fruit, has a pretty decent fall color, but likes east and northeast exposures. Not one that I would stick on the southwest side of the house. More of kind of a corner plant, closer to the house, kind of protected. And then there are crab apples. There's like 400 varieties of crab apples. But if you're going to get crab apples, there's different shapes, sizes, blossoms. But remember, the blossoms last 2 weeks, tops. But then they also produce fruit, which sometimes are good for wildlife. There's some that are yellow, some that are red, some that stay green. And again, there's different, you can get some as small as 8 feet tall, some as tall as 25 to 30 feet tall. Some shaped like a broom head, some that go straight up, some that are wide, a lot of selections. But the key with crab apples, they get a disease called apple scab. Make sure that they're tolerant to apple scab. There are still some selections out on the market that aren't, and if you look around in the next couple weeks, it's already starting, there's crab apples losing their leaves, it's because of apple scab. And every spring that we get these wetter springs, we get a lot of apple scab. But I have trees in my neighborhood that are dropping leaves, and there's a tolerant one right next to it. Will look perfect throughout the year. So the tolerance is really, really pretty good. If we have a really wet year, they may lose a few leaves, but the ones that are intolerant, usually by July 4th, a lot of them, or by August, they hardly have any leaves on them. They'll survive that. It's heavy defoliation, but they usually come back each year. And you can't really treat it. There's no really good way to treat it. So you buy selections that are tolerant to the disease. Okay, I'm done. I think I'm right on time. All right? Sure. Good. So we'll end there, I believe, right?
Sure. Or if we...
Well, and I'll answer questions.
Yes.
And then we'll play a very short video about spring ephemerals that was produced by Bur Oak before we draw for prizes. How does that sound? Okay, we're going to show a brief ephemeral wildlife tour that was done with Bur Oak Land Trust. And if you don't know, Bur Oak Land Trust was one of Nancy Seiberling's projects that she also helped start. And she started Project Green, along with Gretchen Harshberger. So thank you, Bond.
So again, this is the library's website where we have a lot of really cool video. If you want to bookmark with this URL, I just put some on the table back there. So if you want to watch more gardening videos, this video is super cool. It was produced by one of the library's interns during COVID as kind of a virtual program. And if you're not familiar with spring ephemerals, they're native wildflowers that only appear for a very short window, and so it's really neat to have someone from Bur Oak kind of walk you through and show you the actual flowers, and timely because the ephemerals should be appearing quite soon.
Watch this before eating cheese.
Please enjoy this advertisement.
Fermented dairy products like cheese.
Oh, there's one more thing I was supposed to show you and I forgot. On the library's website here, obviously you can go to YouTube just to watch our programming, but if you go through the library's website, we have links to an actual walking tour, a map of Bur Oak, and then we also made this PDF guide to the spring ephemerals with photos of all the pictures, so you could print this and then go on your hike and look for some of these cool flowers.
Hi, I'm Jason Paulus from the Iowa City Public Library, and thank you for joining us for another session here with Bur Oak Land Trust. Today we're at the Turkey Creek property in Johnson County. And this is Lydia. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, my name is Lydia. Yes, today we're at Turkey Creek Nature Preserve. This is one of Bur Oak Land Trust's biggest properties at 107 acres. There's 2 restored prairies here and a woodland habitat.
Today we're going to take a hike around the property and identify some early spring ephemerals. We're here in the second week of April, so if you're out on a hike yet in April, take a look for some of these plants we're seeing here today.
So here we have a pretty common spring ephemeral, root anemone. They're very dainty, delicate little. They can be white to pink. They're easily identified by having a red stem, and also 2 or 3 petals will grow from one main stalk or stem. And these will look pretty similar to spring beauties, but you can tell them apart by the leaf shape and the fact that they're growing in 2 or 3 clusters at the top, whereas spring beauty will usually have one stem and then one petal at the end of it. So this is all of the spring ephemerals are really important for early rising pollinators, such as bumblebees, miner bees, beetles, flies, and ants too. We also have here, this is really, really common in woodland areas, Virginia waterleaf. So this one is pretty easy to tell as well because the leaf looks like it has water stains on it. Very easily identifiable by that. In this time, very, very early spring still, these are going to grow very low to the ground. They're going to pretty much cover most of the forest floor in most areas. But later in May or so, May or June, these are going to grow about this big, and they're going to have clusters of white tubular flowers at the end of them. They actually turn out to be very, very pretty, even though they don't look like much right now. So that's Virginia waterleaf. So we've been seeing all kinds of spring ephemerals here, and you're probably wondering what is the importance of these besides they're just there to look pretty. So spring ephemerals are an extremely important and necessary food source for very early emerging pollinators such as queen bumblebees. Now queen bumblebees that are hibernating through the winter are going to be coming out very early April, sometimes even late March, and they're going to need food and enough food to start their colony in the spring. And where they get that food, the nectar, the pollen, is through these spring ephemerals that are coming up really early. And that's going to be really important for other miner bees as well, beetles, ants. They're all kind of relying on these spring ephemerals to give them the necessary food that they need coming into summer. Now these delicate and very dainty flowers are coming up this early because they're not going to get enough sunlight once the canopy starts to really thicken up. So they're coming out early because they're going to get enough sunlight, and they have 3 goals in mind, which is to successfully pollinate and reproduce and then store enough carbs so they can come back for the next year. So they're coming out and utilizing the sunlight before everything else takes over the forest floor. All right, so I've walked across to the other side here because I spotted a trout lily, 2 actually right next to each other. These are really beautiful, beautiful flowers. They're called trout lilies because their leaves, their mottled leaves, resemble a trout. They're really pretty leaves. Trout lilies are usually going to be either yellow or white like this. Right now, since it's a little bit cloudy, it's cloudy and cold, so their petals are protecting the stamens underneath there, but usually you'll see those petals peel back in a really beautiful fashion, and you'll be able to see the pollen on the inside. So with trout lilies, these are really important in an ecosystem because they actually have a specialist miner bee. Specialist miner bees are going to be bees that come out usually when the trout lily is coming up. So they've timed their emergence from hibernation as this trout lily is coming up, because the trout lily is depending on that miner bee for pollination. And the miner bee is looking for the pollen in the trout lily. So usually with trout lilies, if there is one leaf, it usually means it's a younger trout lily. If there's two, it means it's a older trout lily, has come back year after year. And with both of these, we see that there are 2 leaves, so that means it's probably coming back year 3 or 4, which is awesome to see. So as we were walking, we've come across a lot of spring beauty in these woodlands. We found one that was open here, one of the few. Spring beauty is identified by having this one long elongated leaf here. Like I was saying earlier, you can tell these apart from root anemone by the leaves mostly. And we have here Carolina spring beauty and Virginia spring beauty. How I like to tell those apart is that Virginia spring beauty is going to be, the lobes of the petals are going to be a little more rounded, and the Virginia spring beauty, the lobes are going to be a little more pointed. It's not always the best way, but I found that works for me. And you'll find these pretty common. As you can see, they're kind of all over the place here. Spring beauties also do have specialist miner bees that help in pollination. They're going to be coming for the pollen and the nectar, and in turn pollinating these as well. A little bit further back is a hillside that is usually covered in Virginia bluebells. And as you're approaching it, it's really awesome because the hillside looks gray, or it looks like it's like almost there's smoke on it because there's so many blue flowers covering it. It's really cool. So here we've come across a cluster of May apples on this hillside. You can tell May apples because they will look like an umbrella. They have these really deeply lobed leaves at the very top. Later in the spring and into summer, they're going to produce a really pretty white flower that's going to be kind of under these leaves here. But once that gets pollinated, about June or July, it's going to produce a fruit that's about this big. It's going to be a yellow fruit, and that's really important food source for some browsing animals, and some people even make jam out of mayapple fruit. So right here we have a couple patches of bluebells here, Virginia bluebells. So named because of their flower shape that resemble bells. They have really, really smooth leaves, so even before the flowers are popping out and they're starting to grow, you can see their leaves starting to come out. And when they're just starting to pop out, they're gonna look pink, but as they start to grow, they start to develop into blue petals. And so you get this really nice array of pink and blue on these flowers, which definitely make them a favorite for gardens and also for photography and just for looking at because they're so beautiful. These are also a favorite for bumblebees. Because bumblebees have really long proboscises, they're going to be able to reach down into that tube flower and get get the nectar from it. Not many other bees are able to do that. Another thing that you'll see with Virginia bluebells when they're just starting to emerge is they'll have this dark purple coloration on the leaves. As they're starting to grow, that's going to turn into a bright green. But that's another way that you can tell Virginia bluebells is by their dark purple leaves up top here. Pointed out that here we have the starting of phlox. That's a really common woodland species as well. It grows up to be pretty big, actually, probably usually about this tall, but right now it's still pretty small. They do tend to grow to their full mature height probably by the end of May, and they have really pretty purple flowers at the end of them. Can be clusters of pink, purple, light blue, all sorts of colors. But you can see that the stems and the leaves are hairy. This is what is distinguishable with phlox. Pretty hairy stems and leaves. All right, here we have one of my favorite spring ephemerals, Dutchman's breeches. This is so named because the long, slender pink stem resembles a clothesline, and then the delicate white flowers they look like pants hanging from a clothesline. So kind of a funny name. But these are really awesome because really only the bumblebees are able to get to the very tip of these petals and reach in there with their long proboscis and get the nectar out of there. And at the bottom of Dutchman's breeches is the leaves, which look like very delicate small ferns almost. They're very deeply lobed, grow in clusters here. All right, up on this ridge here, we're coming across a lot of bloodroot. Bloodroot are really delicate flowers. They have the white petals up top here. Right now they're closed since it's not very sunny, but they open up into a really fantastic flower. These flowers do not offer any nectar when they come up, but they do offer a lot of pollen. And so ants will actually help to pollinate this plant. After the seeds drop from this bloodroot, the ants are going to carry the seed back to their home and actually eat the outer coating of the seed that is really nutrient rich. And they're just going to kind of disperse the seed because they don't care for it. They just want the nutrient-rich coating of it. So that's how ants are helping to spread the bloodroot here. And initially it was named bloodroot because the stem, when you open that stem up, it's going to ooze a red liquid out of it. That red liquid, I would not recommend ingesting it. It can be poisonous. You'll see often the bloodroot leaf come out before the actual petal, and it looks a lot like a garlic mustard leaf. But it's going to be more deeply lobed, it's going to be softer and bigger than a garlic mustard leaf. So really commonly seen on woodland forest floors, along gardens, along sidewalks, pretty much everywhere is the common violet. So these come up pretty early too and are a sure sign that spring is coming. With violets, something really interesting about these is that they will actually fling their seed pods 2 to 3 feet away from the stalk so that they can reproduce basically and spread their seeds as far as they can. These are also one of the flowers that are also helped by ants that are taking the seeds and eating the outer nutrient-rich coating of these violets. So usually we see purple, deep purple violets, we see blue, and also sometimes even yellow, which is pretty rare. This is awesome. So these trout lilies are small, but they have their petals peeled back in their usual fashion here so that the yellow stamens aren't exposed. So I hope you guys enjoyed our spring ephemeral walk and learning about all the different spring ephemerals at Turkey Creek. We work really hard here at Bur Oak Land Trust to protect this habitat and protect these woodlands from development and improve the quality of habitat, so we still have these spring ephemerals around for many generations to come. We have a guide, a spring ephemeral guide that will be posted by the library, so you can print it off and follow along on your hike at Turkey Creek. There's going to be some flowers on there that we did not cover today because they're not out, but if you come back in a couple of weeks, you'll see a lot more stuff blooming.